Well, it's a great pleasure to have with us Nouriel Roubini, perhaps the person who knows more about the way the world is headed than anyone else. And it's always such a privilege to be here at Davos to get your sense of what's going to happen in the coming year. So let me dive straight into it. Donald Trump about to become the president of the United States. Is that going to shake up the world? And if so, for good or for bad?
It will certainly shake out the world. And there is a huge amount of uncertainty about what is domestic and foreign economic policy going to be, let alone his own foreign security policies and otherwise. So we're living in a world of significant uncertainty given the election of Donald Trump.
But there's something which is confusing many people, that given that uncertainty, why are the American stock markets up so much? They've risen since Donald Trump came in. And I know they're expecting infrastructure spending and tax cuts and the rest, but there is uncertainty.
Well, the market has been rising because, first of all, there will be a stimulus between spending cuts, increase in tax cuts that are going to boost growth in the short run. Secondly, it's going to cut taxes mostly for the rich and the corporate, cutting the income taxes and the corporate taxes, capital gains taxes, estate taxes. Three is going to slash regulations on energy, oil, resources, on labor, on financial sector, on pharma, on healthcare. So the stock market, of course, is giddy about that, but there is a concern that inconsistent policies by the Trump administration over time are going to weaken economic growth and lead to a market correction.
So if you had to bet right now, or you had to think of which way the markets are likely to head, having risen in this sort of market honeymoon with Trump, would you say that the risk is more of a slide than of a further upside?
Well, for a few months, the market and the economy can improve. He's going to use the first 100 days of his administration as a honeymoon period in which every day is going to announce some cut in regulation of one sort or another. But the inconsistency in his economic policy derives from the fact that he wants to do a massive fiscal stimulus in an economy that's close to full employment. That over time is going to increase inflation. That increase in spending and cutting taxes is going to push long-term interest rates higher. It's going to increase the value of the dollar. And those things are going to tighten financial conditions, and they're going to hurt the white blue-collar who voted for him. Higher interest rates crimp real estate, they crimp capital spending and investment, and a stronger dollar is going to significantly reduce manufacturing jobs. So the results of this fiscal stimulus, together then with a Fed that even a dovish Fed like the Yellen Fed will have to tighten faster because inflation is going to pick up faster when we have a fiscal stimulus we cannot afford, implies that then it's going to have to become very protectionist on trade, on migration, on globalization. And that's going to spook the market, first of all, and it's going to lead to the risk of trade and currency wars around the world. So initially a honeymoon, but inconsistent fiscal monetary mix that leads to strong dollar, higher interest rates, then to response of protectionism to try to give some red meat to his base, and then trade wars and retaliation may lead over time to growth slow down and market correct.
So if you were another country, if you were an emerging market, you were one of America's trade partners, would you be scared about the period that is coming up, that there will actually genuinely be protectionism? Many presidents or many politicians talk about, oh, we're going to cut down on outsourcing, we're not going to stop the export of jobs, but eventually they don't do much about it. Do you think Trump will actually do something about it?
Well, he's already spoken about it. He's bashing U.S. corporations that are leaving in U.S. and start manufacturing in Mexico. He's complaining about the exchange rate and trade policies of China. There is a risk of protectionism, and also the strengthening of the dollar leads to weakness of emerging market currencies. Many of these countries have borrowed a lot in dollar, and when the dollar appreciates, the real value of their dollar debt rises, and that puts potential financial stresses on some of those highly indebted emerging markets.
So if you were in a country like India, you would be concerned?
Well, in the case of India, I'm less concerned than about a typical emerging market for a variety of reasons. India is a less open economy to trade and financial links than the typical emerging markets. India, among the major emerging markets, doing well. with a strong economic growth so far, and therefore global shock have the less of an ability to impact India than other emerging markets. And of course, India doesn't have the very large trade surplus that, for example, China has with the United States, and therefore the risk of India being bashed on trade issues and so on is, of course, extremely narrow risk.
Of course, I guess the bigger shocks to India can come from within India, like we've just seen with the currency ban. I was just curious as to what your take on that was, this entire episode of cash ban in India.
Well, I think that Prime Minister Modi had, first of all, the right idea. I think that trying to reduce the amount of tax avoidance and tax evasion is something important. And in a world in which there is already a big gap between haves and haves not and rising inequality, it's important that there is a certain degree of fairness. I think that probably the implementation of that policy was partially botched. Of course, they wanted to maintain the secrecy. They don't print enough of the new currency in the small denomination, and in an economy that is a lot based on cash, that has led to a liquidity squeeze that may affect, for at least a few quarters, economic activity by leading to some degree of economic slowdown.
But I know the argument has been used that secrecy would have prevented the printing of notes in advance, but actually there could have been ways around it. They could have just simply said, we are printing a new series of 500 rupee notes, new design, it's pink in color, it's got some logo on it, and then printed, hundreds and thousands of crores of rupees, kept them in a warehouse, and then after demonetization, they could have remonetized really fast, and a lot of the pain wouldn't have hit.
As I pointed out, and I agree with you, the implementation of the idea was partially botched, and that's the sense in which there were mistakes made. They thought that the secrecy implies they shouldn't print enough, but as you pointed out, there were alternative plans that were not implemented, and that has led to the liquidity squeeze that's going to have some impact on economic activity. Of course, there are also ways of bypassing, essentially that demonetization by rich people giving the money to less rich people and giving the transformation and so on. So, as we've seen, there's an element of arbitrage.
There's some laundering that has taken place. If you look at the rest of the world now, and I'm just taking it through item by item, Europe, if 2016 was a year where lots of unforeseen events took place, like Brexit or the election of Donald Trump, what do you think is going to happen in Europe? Because there will be some conclusion, I assume, in Brexit this year. There are some important elections like France and others as well. Do you expect a lot of uncertainty and risk in Europe?
Well, from the economic and financial point of view, last year was actually an okay year for Europe and the Eurozone. Actually, the Eurozone growth at 1.7% was larger than the one of the US at the mediocre 1.4%, at least for a year. So the baseline on economic activity for Europe is actually okay, and the strengthening of the dollar and the weakness of the euro may help actually on the margin. I think that the uncertainty in Europe derived from political and geopolitical uncertainties. You have the Brexit, and the negotiations are going to be difficult and potentially contentious, but more important, there is a series of elections in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands. We may or may not have elections in Italy. If it's not this year, it's going to be next year. And if there is a tide of a populist backlash against globalization that's hit even the economies among the Western ones who have done better economically, UK and US, where growth has been above 2%, unemployment has fallen from 10 to 5. What about continental Europe and Eurozone, where many economies have even lower growth, 1% or less, where unemployment is high, where job creation is anemic, where real incomes are not growing? That backlash could be severe. We could have political surprises in France, in Italy, in the Netherlands. Even in the case of Germany, these anti-Euro parties may have an electoral surprise that is positive for them. So I would say the political risk in the Europe and the Eurozone are the important one at a time where the Trump administration is giving mixed signal, saying maybe the NATO is obsolete, maybe we don't believe in the European Union. The alliance between US and Europe has been a keystone of the peace and stability that the world has had for the last 70 years. Now it is being shaken up by the uncertainties of what Trump wants to do.
All right, finally, China. There seems to be a renewed optimism, certainly at Davos. I mean, Davos is not necessarily always correct on what's going to happen in the world, but there seems to be renewed optimism almost about China? Or how do you see that playing out?
Well, a year ago was the time where people were worried about Chinese hard landing. Then the policy stimulus occurred in China again. Growth has picked up and stabilized. And since they have an important political transition this year, National People in Congress, changes in the Standing Committee, they want to keep growth stable and not create any domestic political noises. The risk, however, is that the only way in which they're maintaining high growth for the last few years is that every time growth slows down, they double down on another round of credit-fueled fixed investment. That means more bad assets, more bad debts, more leverage, more overcapacity, when the rhetoric is all about rebalancing away from capex towards consumption, rebalancing growth, and make it more efficient and so on.
So potentially they're just kicking the can down the road, and there could be a big hole at some point.
Yes. This year growth will be stable, but by kicking the can down the road, they're creating economic and financial vulnerability that increase by next year or the following year the risk of a harder landing in China and its financial system.
So, Professor Roubini, with so much uncertainty around, why not just buy gold and sit on it?
I'm not sure that gold is going to be the right thing to buy this year. The Fed is going to gradually exit the zero policy rate. That's not good for gold. There are plenty of other risky assets that give you not just a capital gain, but also some income stream, whether those are credit instruments or real estate or equities. And therefore, unless there is a major geopolitical shock or a major financial shock that is not my baseline, I don't think that there is a huge amount of upside into gold.
All right. Professor Roubini, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Great being with you. Thank you.